Thanks for everyone for joining us this evening. The week of events that we've had have been very successful, and we want to thank everyone for coming. I want to remind people that there's more events after this. There is a gig in the shop from 9:30, and tomorrow we have the annual James Connolly commemoration up at Amber Hill. The weather is going to be bad tomorrow, but I'm reliably informed by Met Aaron that between 3 and 4 there's actually going to be a bit of peace, a bit of sun. So if you can join us up there, that'd be great. Tonight's contributor, this evening's contributor, is Harun Siljak. He is a member of the Communist Party of Ireland. He's a steadfast activist. There's many people who are in tune with theory but not action, or action and not theory, but this guy seems to mesh them both together. Harun is familiar in the scenes and the housing activist scene in Katu, but also on Palestine more recently, and in an age where we're seeing police and state repression on protests on issues of Palestine. He's also a legal observer and has been training people on that. The title of tonight's event, or tonight's lecture, is No Green Without the Red, on sovereignty, environment and class. It's very kind of Irish, or related to Ireland. And Harun, you'll find from his accent, is probably not Irish, but he's no better person to give this talk. He's in tune. He's an authoritative figure on Irish history, on Irish culture, and we're delighted to have him. He stands in tradition of these talks where we've had very international speakers, shall we say, Andrew Murray, Vijay Prashad, John Benjamin Foster, etc. However, we felt tonight that we would give the floor to someone from home, and with that being said, I want to welcome Harun.
We'd the winter na hair and igoni agus fua don befaldiacht. It's with these kind words Thomas O'Neill described James Fintan Lawler early in his biography. He always had fervent love for the people of Ireland and a hatred of foolish politics. As romantic as the line reads, in today's terms we would agree that Lawler was steered by solid analysis and not pathos. Born in Tinnakill, County Laois in 1810, Lawler was a distinctive voice, quote, keenest intellects in Ireland in his day, as Connolly described him in Labour in Irish History. O'Neill, as Lawler's biographer, was dismayed by Connolly's treatment of Lawler, making, quote, a little Karl Marx of him, end quote. Every good reader of Connolly will know this is blatantly untrue. The little Karl Marx of Ireland was William Thompson of Clonkeene or Scarberry, County Cork. Now, jokes aside, for most of us familiar with Lawler today, Connolly's account in Labour in Irish History was the entry point to Lawler's work. It's only appropriate to now quote Connolly, quoting Lawler. Quote, in his writings, as we study them today, we find principles of action and of society which have within them not only the best plan of campaign suited for the needs of a country seeking its freedom through insurrection against a dominant nation, but also held the seeds of the more perfect social peace of the future. All his writings at this period are so illuminating that we find it difficult to select from the mass any particular passages which more deserve reproduction than others. But as an indication of the line of argument pursued by this peerless thinker, and as a welcome contrast to the paralyzing respect, nay reverence for landlordism evidenced by Smith O'Brien and his worshippers, perhaps the following passages will serve. In an article entitled The Faith of a Felon, published July 8, 1848, he tells how he had striven to convert the Irish Confederation to his views and failed, and says, they wanted an alliance with the landowners. They chose to consider them as Irishmen and imagined they could induce them to hoist the green flag. They wished to preserve an aristocracy. They desired not a democratic, but merely a national revolution. Had the Confederation, in the May or June of 47, thrown heart and mind and means into the movement, I pointed out they would have made it successful and settled at once and forever all questions between us and England. The opinions I then stated, and which I yet stand firm to, are these. 1. That in order to save their own lives, the occupying tenants of the soil of Ireland ought, next autumn, to refuse all rent and arrears of rent then due, beyond and except the value of the overplus of harvest produce remaining in their hands, after having deducted and reserved a due and full provision for their own subsistence during the next ensuing 12 months. 2. That they ought to refuse and resist being made beggars, landless and homeless, under the English law of ejection. 3. That they ought further on principle to refuse all rent to the present usurping proprietors until the people, the true proprietors, or lords paramount in legal parlance, have in National Congress or Convention decided what rents they are to pay and to whom they are to pay them. 4. And that the people, on grounds of policy and economy, ought to decide, as a general rule admitting of reservations, that these rents shall be paid to themselves, the people, for public purposes and for behoof and benefit of them, the entire general people. It has been said to me that such a war, on the principles I propose, would be looked on with detestation by Europe. I assert the contrary. I say such a war would propagate itself throughout Europe. Mark the words of this prophecy. The principle I propound goes to the foundations of Europe, and sooner or later will cause Europe to outrise. Mankind will yet be masters of the earth. The rise of the people to make the laws, this produced the first great modern earthquake, whose latent shocks, even now, are heaving in the heart of the world. The right of the people to own the land, this will produce the next. Train your hands, and your sons' hands, gentlemen of the earth, for you and they will yet have to use them. End quote. Lawler emerges from, to cite the man himself, the mists of a famine, but very conscious of the particular and universal conditions alike. O'Neill writes that, quote, it was obvious that it was not his intention to construct a philosophical system. The opposite is what he had in mind. In fact, his aim was the relief of economic deprivation. Now, it does sound like that Lawler, absolutely not a little Karl Marx, held the belief that the philosophers had only interpreted the world in various ways, while the point, however, was to change it. In another anecdotal Marx-styled move, Lawler introduced the metaphor of the land question being the steam engine to pull the train of nationalism after it. Of course, we're reminded of Marx's revolutions as locomotives of history. When Lawler speaks of land, and indeed everything in the country, he's clear. Grab any copy of the Irish Worker in the archives, you will find Lawler's words on the masthead. Quote, the principle I state and mean to stand upon is this, that the entire ownership of Ireland, moral and material, up to the sun and down to the centre, is vested of right in the people of Ireland. There's your starry plough, from the land to the stars. And we don't ask for the stars to exploit them, but to see them. We have so far, through fragments of Lawler's political thought leading up to the revolutionary 1848, assembled the main components of today's topic: land, sovereignty, and the ideas that connect them. Ideas green, red, and train-like. The tiresome and so often anti-dialectic discussion of precedence of the green and red occupies a lot of space. Locally, the green in question would be that of nationalism or of republicanism. Internationally, the green-red conversation dons the green of environmentalism. In today's analysis, we will be looking at both greens. The Irish green-red discussion has two major focal points. Unsurprisingly so, as those 2 points are the biggest historical attractors of the 20th century socialist history in Ireland, that of James Connolly and of the Republican struggle in the north of Ireland. Sean O'Casey would often be used as the typical representative of the voices that would challenge Connolly for swapping the red flag with the green on the march from the lockout to the rising. And then we have, for example, historian John White, who, taking a look at the north of Ireland in 1978, writes that, quote, nationalist sentiment has great force for those who have been socialized to accept it. But it has nothing to do with Marxism. Those who adopt the traditional Marxist analysis in Ireland are green before they are red, end quote. Now, to paraphrase Che, it's not my fault if reality is green. The Irish context of colonization, recognized by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, casts a long shadow over the material conditions and consequently the nature of social relations. From the Rising, the Tan War, and the Partition, to the foreign direct investments, Shannon and Aldergrove, and collapse of housing, health, and planning, there's a long and crooked line to be drawn. These conditions cannot be readily replaced by those of European countries, but also not by those of the colonies in the rest of the world. The Irish characteristics dominate the context. And now for the other green, we turn back to Lawler's locomotive, the land question. Here I accept the danger of complacing the environment with the land, and I do it consciously for a number of historical and contemporary reasons. Let us begin with the contemporary. Alienation from the land. In the common urban discourse, the perception of land, agricultural or otherwise, has been removed from the human experience. Virtualized and ethereal, entangled with the perception of the farmer as a tractor parked in the city centre during a protest over a policy portrayed in the media as a clear-cut deal, land is simply alien. If we for a moment take the land to be a representative of the environment we live and work in, what sense is there to sever the fundamental metabolic connection between us and the land? The sense, of course, is that of alienation from labor, from resources, and opening space for commodification and super-exploitation. So when Lawler speaks of land, it's about securing everyone's existence and ending exploitation by means of self-sufficiency. Property is recognized as means of colonial exploitation, and while Lawler by no means goes on to abolish it, he makes sure it serves a liberating, emancipating cause after the revolution, that of security of subsistence put first. Remember, this is 1848 Ireland. Insecurity of subsistence is at its extreme in form of mass murder. The mass in question is far from the, again to quote Lawler, the 8,000 individuals who are owners of Ireland by divine right and the grant of God confirmed by themselves in sundry successive acts of Parliament, end quote. Today, the environmental green is a good shade to paint over the contradictions of the capitalist system. One wide brush for that task is the pronoun we. Take, for example, the idea of the climate crisis as the great equalizer, all of us being on the same proverbial boat. If we needed a more blatant, almost cartoonish demonstration of this particular fallacy, the COVID pandemic took us through all the stages of the same boat theatre. It should not be controversial to say it. There are no natural disasters. That does not imply some sort of particularly malevolent agency. To quote the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, quote, "A natural hazard, such as a hurricane, earthquake, or flood, only becomes a disaster when it impacts a community that is not adequately protected and whose population is vulnerable as a result of poverty, exclusion, or socially disadvantaged." In that perspective, it's hard to imagine the boat to be the same. The pronoun we can hardly permeate the class division when we speak of effects of climate change, but equally so it has no use in describing the effects on the environment. The forces of production have the capacity of exploitation of both the worker and the environment at the literal industrial scale. Hardly the same boat. Look at Lawler in the famine times, not just recognizing the specific nature of the colonizer-caused disaster, but resisting the obscuring of causes in the public sphere. Take, for instance, when the Bishop of New York, John Hughes, said the following, quote, "I may be told that this famine is a visitation of divine providence, but I do not admit that. I fear there is blasphemy in charging on the Almighty the result of our own doings. God's famine is known by the general scarcity of food, of which it is the consequence. There's no general scarcity. There has been no general scarcity in Ireland, either during the present or the past year, except in one solitary species of vegetable. The soil has produced its usual tribute for the support of those by whom it was cultivated. The vice inherent in our system of social and political economy is so settled that it eludes inquiry. You cannot trace it to the source. The poor man on whom the coroner holds an inquest has been murdered, but no one killed him. Who did it? No one did it. Yes, it was done." End quote. Now there, Lawler asks, but is it indeed so obscure? Has it then been able to conceal or disguise itself? It must be dragged out. Then he proceeds to drag out the class context, the class interest. Quote, "The landowners grew bustling, if not busy, in the work of demanding relief and dispensing it. To the local relief funds, very many of them indeed contributed nothing. But there was others who contributed even so large a sum as 0.00025% on their annual income, and were most properly appreciated and praised as beneficent individuals, while several gave a percentage of double or thrice that amount, and Ireland rung with applause. They demanded the Labour Rates Act, called for works which would increase the productive powers of the soil, and grew clamorous in the expression of pity for their suffering countrymen, whom they charged government with delivering off the famine by adopting an erroneous and insufficient system of relief. Finally, under the flag of their country, they met in the rotunda and formed an Irish party for the professed object of establishing and supporting an Irish party for Irish purposes. That is to say, for the purpose of taking care that the pecuniary interests of the landowners of Ireland should suffer no detriment, more especially by any extension of poor law relief. Such is the history of the present famine. Does it furnish or suggest an answer to the concluding query of Dr. Hughes?" End quote. It's with this clarity we must approach the crises of our time and dispel the mystery around their causes. In our analysis, we cannot be blinded by the simplicity of the immediate cause, be it a potato-killing microorganism, oxygen-sucking water algae, or a deadly immunity-stripping virus. We cannot be blinded by complexity of the networks of capital that cause, exploit, and manage crises as their opportunities. We must be capable of identifying the ways this happens, recognizing where their choke points are, and mobilizing in resistance against them. For a moment, I want to look at the socialist visions of our time, focusing on the environment. One that asserts dominance through its effectiveness is the Chinese doctrine of the ecological civilization. It is often encapsulated within its motto: we want green waters and green mountains, but we also want gold mountains and silver mountains. It's better to have green waters and green mountains than gold mountains and silver mountains. And green waters and the green mountains are gold mountains and silver mountains. End quote. This hits close to home with the literal gold mountains and green mountains in the Sperrins, and of course, the catastrophe of Lough Neagh. It's simple enough when Xi Jinping states it. In the dialectics of development and protection of the environment must come first. The mechanics of practice are obviously complex. Chen Yuan, in this month's monthly review, writes, quote, "First, it's necessary to reconcile the relationship between utilizing and restraining capital. Compared to most countries and regions in the world, contemporary China, having established a basic socialist system, has more favorable social conditions for promoting ecological civilization. One important aspect of this is the continuous greening of the political ideology and governance strategies of the CPC. For example, the 20th National Congress emphasized that Chinese modernization is socialist modernization, and that, quote, respecting, adapting to, and protecting nature is essential for building China into a modern socialist country in all respects, end quote. However, due to the social conditions of the primary stage of socialism and the influence of the capitalist-dominated world system, China's eco-civilizational progress cannot simply reject economic policy tools based on market mechanisms and capital functions. These internationally mainstreamed green development measures, while seemingly universally effective if developed and widely applied, may impact and erode socialist institutions and cultural concepts. For this reason, since 2020, the CPC and the government have repeatedly emphasized that we must understand the nature of capital and how it works, setting up traffic lights for capital to make sure that no capital of any type can be allowed to run out of control. Therefore, China's progress towards ecological civilization must not only break free from traditional underdeveloped socialism, but also guard against the green capitalism trap. This means fully utilizing market mechanisms, fiscal and financial policies, and capital management methods to optimize the allocation of natural resources and build a green modern economic system. It also requires accelerating the improvement of the socialist institutional system, exploring effective forms of public ownership, and continually enhancing the ability to engage with capital and control it, thereby advancing the historical trends of transcendent capital through itself." End quote. I am, for a particular reason, here reminded of Lenin and the question of attracting foreign capital in the USSR under the new economic policy. Both the NEP and the ecological civilization navigating the international capital landscape acknowledge the material conditions and try to develop socialism within the contradictions of hegemonic capitalism. And yet, neither of those two examples mean that we can go home and sleep well, remembering that Ireland is merrily running a foreign direct investment-based economy and turning environmental policy into a mere game of capital. What is the fundamental difference here? Well, Fintan Lawler wrote, quote, "In order to negotiate, the parties must stand on equal terms and each be independent of the other," end quote. O'Neill quotes this line as the ideological predecessor of De Valera's line in 1928 that, quote, if peace is to come, the negotiations must be conducted between nation and nation, end quote. Obviously, otherwise we have Kanafani's negotiation of the neck with the sword. While it's open to a depressing debate how much of the negotiations from the treaty over the Belfast Agreement to that of Nice and Lisbon happened on such terms, sovereignty is the cornerstone of any meaningful action. We cannot have our new economic plan or be part of the ecological civilization without it. There's a lot to be gained from debates on means of controlling capital after the revolution, but none of that replaces the revolution itself. There's probably something to be gained from debates of critique of the power, but none of that replaces the revolution itself. Revolution in name, too, does not replace that in essence. In vain of Connolly's oft-cited green flag in Dublin Castle, Lawler writes, quote, the land question contains, and the legislative question does not contain, the materials from which victory is to be manufactured, end quote. The Free State was no victory for the working class, no matter how heavily legislated. The bourgeois structures consolidated and replaced the previous power in a move by no means unique to Ireland. When one reads Mahdi Amal, his analysis of the colonial mode of production, so much of it rhymes with the post-treaty Ireland, including but not limited to the issue of class consciousness, bourgeois betrayal, and comprador relations. For a moment, I want to bring you back to the Mountains of Gold. The story of the phrase origin dates it back to 2005 and Yu Village, once the richest village in Anji County in China, with its mining and cement production amounting to 95% of income. In the early 2000s, the village made the decision to close the mines and save the declining ecosystem. She visited the village in 2005 and spoke of the Mountains of Green and the Mountains of Gold, praising the initiative. Now, I'm not offering an idyllic story of happily ever after, but I am looking at Sperrins, at Shout to Sea, at Shannon LNG, and imagining democracy at work, the power to refuse and the vision to accept the refusal as the correct ideological choice. In a country where capital organizes into hegemonic political force, this is impossible. You don't get acceptance and praise, you get a tread in the back of a Garda car. Now, you don't need Amal to tell you about the tale of colonialism, which, as much as a tale of a cat is a cat, remains colonialism and should not be taken as a different, weaker, or less vicious base. The removal of the colonial army is the initial success, and we haven't had that success either. The exploitation that comes afterwards, in which foreign capital overpowers and overwhelms, determines class relations and conscripts the colony into the current state of imperial order. That's a fundamental historical dynamic. As we celebrate these days, 70 years since the Bandon Conference, we celebrate the collective effort to subvert this dynamic by the non-aligned states. Non-alignment was a project of national liberation, push against colonialism and dependence. It's an anti-imperialist movement, not founded on a moralist premise or pure dislike of war, exploitation, or apartheid. Now, Sean Lemass dispels any confusion on why Ireland is not a part of the non-aligned movement. I quote, I think it would be highly undesirable that remarks made here should give the impression in Europe that there is a public opinion in this country which regards membership of NATO as something discreditable. The view of the government in that regard has been made clear. We think the existence of NATO is necessary for the preservation of peace and for defense of the countries of Western Europe, including this country. Although we are not members of NATO, we are in full agreement with its aims. End quote. This is Lemass at his economic expansion peak. His bid to join the European Economic Community just failed, but the efforts to become the best client state in the world continue as he takes more control over international affairs from Frank Aiken. The Europe Lemass cares about is in the lineage of the same Europe Lawler was speaking of, the imperialist project perfecting the dynamics of capital. The same lineage gives us the militarizing fortress Europe of today, which leaves us with the moral, material, and immediate obligation to resist it. For good measure, at the very end of this talk, I want to, at least superficially, disagree with one position of Lawler's. Quote, any man who tells you that an act of armed resistance, even if offered by 10 men only, even if offered by men armed only with stones, any man who tells you that such an act of resistance is premature, imprudent, or dangerous, any and every such man should at once be spurned and spat at. For remark you this, and recollect it, that somewhere and somehow, and by somebody, a beginning must be made, and that the first act of resistance is always, and must be ever, premature, imprudent, and dangerous. Lexington was premature, Bunker's Hill was imprudent, and even Trenton was dangerous. End quote. Here, Lawler passionately runs into the fallacy of the absolute while trying to make a solid point. Neither an anarchist or an idealist, Lawler knows better than to suggest action for the sake of it. He wants to make the point of missing 100% of the shots you don't take. But is that a salient point when you have major threat of a known goal with every shot? Now, I'm admittedly not the first person to superimpose this Lawler's quote with that of Lenin on the Easter Rising. Albert Glotzer got there first. I quote, the misfortune of the Irish lay in the fact that their rising was untimely, since the rising of the European proletariat was not yet ripe. Capitalism is not so harmoniously constructed that separate sources of risings can suddenly unite without failure of overthrow. On the contrary, the difference in time, the difference and dissimilarity in the place of the risings act as a guarantee for the greatness and depth of the joint movements. It's only by untimely, partially and consequently unsuccessful attempts at revolutionary risings that the masses will gain experience, learn, assemble their forces, recognize their true leaders, the socialist proletarians, and thereby prepare the joint attack. Just as isolated strikes, town and national demonstrations, mutinies in the army, peasant uprisings, etc., prepared the general attack in 1905, end quote. Lenin articulated what Lawler had the stem of in his quote. The fundamental premise of dialectical materialism put into practice. Now, let's allow Lawler to speak longer and show the revolutionary vision. This long quote was in one of the last pamphlets Podrick Pierce prepared before the Rising. Quote, without agreement as to our objects, we cannot agree on the course we should follow. It is requisite the paper should have but one purpose, and the public should understand what that purpose is. Mine is not to repeal the Union or restore 82. This is not the year of 82, this is the year of 48. For repeal, I never went into agitation and will not go into insurrection. On that question, I refuse to arm or to act in any mode, and the country refuses. O'Connell made no mistake when he pronounced it not worth the price of one drop of blood. And for myself, I regret it was not left in the hands of Conciliation Hall, whose lawful property it was and is. Moral force and repeal, the means and the purpose, were just fitted to each other. Arcades ambo, balmy Arcadians both. When the means were limited, it was only proper and necessary to limit the purpose. When the means were enlarged, that purpose ought to have been enlarged also. Repeal, in its vulgar meaning, I look on as utterly impracticable by any modes of action whatever. And the Constitution of 82 was absurd, worthless, and worse than worthless. The English government will never concede or surrender to any species of moral force whatsoever, and the country peasantry will never arm and fight for us. Neither will I. If I am to stake life and fame, it must assuredly be for something better and greater, more likely to last, more likely to succeed, and better worth success. And a stronger passion, a higher purpose, a nobler and more needful enterprise is fermenting in the hearts of the people. A mightier question moves Ireland today than that of merely repealing the Act of Union. Not the Constitution that Wolfe Tone died to abolish, but the Constitution that Tone died to obtain. Independence. Full and absolute independence for this island, and for every man within this island. Into no movement that would leave an enemy's garrison in possession of all our lands, masters of our liberties, our lives, and all our means of life and happiness. Into no such movement will a single man of the grey coats enter with an armed hand, whatever the town population might do. On a wider fighting field, with stronger positions and greater resources than are afforded by the paltry question of repeal, must we close for our final struggle with England, or sink and surrender. Ireland her own, and all therein, from the sod to the sky. The soil of Ireland, for the people of Ireland, to have and hold, from God alone who gave it, to have and to hold to them and their heirs forever, without suit or service, faith or fealty, rent or render, to any power under heaven. When a greater and more ennobling enterprise is on foot, every inferior and feebler project or proceeding will soon be left in the hands of old women, of dastards, impostors, swindlers, and imbeciles. All the strength and manhood of the island, all the courage, energies, and ambition, all the passion, heroism, and chivalry, all the strong men and strong minds, all those that make revolutions, will quickly desert it, and throw themselves into the greater movement, throng into the larger and loftier undertaking, and flock round the banner that flies nearest the sky. There go the young, the gallant, the gifted, the daring, and there too go the wise. For wisdom knows that in national action, littleness is more fatal than the wildest rashness. That greatness of object is essential to greatness of effort, strength, and success. That a revolution ought never to take its stand on low or narrow ground, but seize on the broadest and highest ground it can lay hands on, and that petty enterprise seldom succeeds. Had America aimed or declared for less than independence, she would probably have failed and been fettered slave today. Not to repeal the Union then, but the conquest. Not to disturb or dismantle the empire, but to abolish it utterly forever. Not to fall back on 82, but to act up to 48. Not to resume or restore an old constitution, but found a new nation and raise up a free people, and strong as well as free, and secure as well as strong, based on peasantry rooted like rocks in the soil of the land. This is my object, as I hope is yours. And this, you may rest assured, is the easier as it is the nobler and more pressing enterprise. End quote. It was a different time, and there was not much to write home about the year of 48. Yet it's refreshing to note the focus on the goals and not confusing means for ends in Lawler's thought. The symbolic intermediate goal stems from the wrong idealist position and has no potential of being the rallying point. Lawler has no interest in moral high ground, but in winning actual material change. He doesn't see space for a waste of resources there, and surely that's not where he would speak of 10 men with stones. When Lawler speaks of the value of resistance, it's in the historical processes with revolutionary potential. Now I'm guilty of making him a little Lenin, apologies to Thomas O'Neill. And of course, this is not the year of 48. this is the year of 25, and make of that what you will. Gurv Mahagas, a Hamish Inton, Ealaur, Gurv Mahagas, Hamish O'Conneil, Agus Gurv Mahagav Galar.
Now, if anyone wants to,
In the tradition of Connolly, I'm getting a chair.
yes. Oh, okay.
Well, thanks very much, Harun. It was great. Lawler and was at odds with O'Connell around different visions of what land reform would look like in the Ireland at the time. There's a lot of discussion and at the moment of rewilding these types of ideas, sort of removing people from the land. Not that there's anything wrong with exceptions of rural areas that are in keeping with nature, but they remove people. People are not part of these visions that are being posited in a lot of circles at the moment. My own family, my mother's family would have been more or less subsistence farming into the 90s. And I feel that that way of life is sort of on the way out now. They were able to do that because of partial victories of the revolutionary period. It was Fianna Fáil had their base from those people. But now we're in an era where things have drastically changed in rural Ireland. You've seen a lot of depopulation. There's a lot of areas never recovered from the famine population-wise. And I'm seeing even further depopulation at the moment and more consolidation of land ownership. So with all of that in mind, what should our positive vision of these rural Ireland be now? And that would be what I have in mind, that there has to be a place for development too. And as I'm sure, I think we've discussed this in the past as well, tourism isn't a solution. So tourism is only suitable for certain places, and it's very much extractive. In a lot of the Gaeltacht areas, it's actually killing the Gaeltachts. Just what your thoughts on that are.
Thanks for that, then. There's an easy answer and a difficult answer. I'll try with the difficult one first, and then might come to the easy one in tradition of Lenin, probably. But the difficult one would be along the lines of this competition. So if rewilding is to compete with livelihoods, if it is to compete with communities and the life experience and any sort of actual life on the ground without consultation, without a particular grand vision, but rather in an exercise of box ticking and following up on either the national or the European acts in this regard, we're obviously at odds. We're obviously at odds with the people, and we're obviously then at odds again, coming back to the intrinsic link between sovereignty and land. We're at odds with the sovereignty because it's the people that this sovereignty comes from. And this is a highbrow sort of a formulation of the idea, I suppose, that there is no genuine benefit of for the people if the measures introduced, no matter how appropriate the actual tools for them are, if those measures are not aligned with the best interest of people. Because again, the same intervention done by it's not exactly the same, but let's see how I get to formulate this. The same tool used by a state that is on the onset of its socialist journey, or a state that has developed its socialist systems, and a capitalist state. The very same tools put in the very same direction will have absolutely different effects. And from that perspective, the tools applied by the green capitalist or whatever other colored capitalist state will result in exploitation and fundamentally alienation, because the effects that we're seeing there, the removal from the land, the removal from the community, and the removal from the ability to make a livelihood and to exist in a space without an alternative, with an alternative that is very much a very prescribed and very tightly framed, is an act of alienation. So the lazy armchair argument here is, well, after the revolution we will do things differently. But in the lack of a nice armchair here, I will have to resort to actual organizing on the ground here, and we need to connect these struggles. That's it. We need to connect the struggles of the lands with those elsewhere, because as I said earlier, the experience of the land has been going through a process of alienation and removal from the experience of life. Sorry.
Brilliant. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. I see you've got a fate worse than Connie. They've given you a chair, but you have to conduct your own firing squad here. So I want to ask a question, and maybe it's actually quite linked to that. So I guess we have the green and the red, which is the subject of your talk. I think what we're seeing is an emerging threat of the green and the brown, and the dual sense of your green with land and sovereignty, or the environment and nation, let's say, and the rise of the far right. And there's been a lot of discussion about that in urban contexts, and the very classist way that this is being framed in the media and in some political organising as well. But this is also a problem that's rising across rural communities, gets less attention. And how, in a sense, questions of land and questions of sovereignty have been assigned in a certain kind of post-68 kind of, anarchistic inflected politics as being, say, postmodern, let's say, as being kind of inherently reactionary. And what your comments are about how we might reclaim those kind of, and you've done a good job of doing this in the lecture, but maybe expand that, how we might reclaim those kind of concepts of land and sovereignty away from the rise of the far right and the easy prey that those concepts fall into in that moment.
That's a very hard question. Great question. It's a burning question of our time, and I'll tell you that while I was reading some of Fintan Lawler's quotes there, I was just imagining video of someone watching the video of it, or someone cropping bits and pieces and constructing a sort of a far right narrative out of it, because the policing of particular phrasing and particular emotional load that sovereignty and lands have, it has indeed, as you have recognized the genealogy there, in postmodern condition been on the rise. Now, the easy answer and the hard answer, I suppose, both exist. I'll again try and go with the hard one first. It's a conversation that we need to have, and again, it's funny, we keep talking about having a conversation and we never actually end up having a conversation. The idea of a conversation has been used to signal a particular politic rather than actually being inclined to do the work for the conversation. And the green-brown and the defense against it and the conversation that needs to happen to make sure that the story of the land is not the story of blood and soil and what else, and at the same time that there is a fundamental tradition needs to recognize the fundamental Irish context. So again, this is slightly a trope, I suppose, and a slightly empty argument. But let's see where can I take it. So we talk about importing the American or English narrative into our conversations. We get to see a lot of that while being stripped of the actual local context, using a particular verbiage that is very American or very British, and planting it into the Irish discourse, mostly on the right, but not just on the right. And this needs to be recognized in spaces, in conversation spaces, and combated through the Irish context. Again, I don't have easy solutions here. I don't have a list of things that we can pull off here, but I do recognize that as long as this conversation is kept generic and kept in platitudes that are not exactly reflecting the current Irish moment or all of the 20th century that has led to the current Irish moment, we don't stand a chance there. We will be fighting on a turf that's not local and that doesn't really exist. So if you strip it from materiality, from the local materiality, you have stripped it from actual arguments of dialectic materialism.
For Robert, on the question of the land, it is a fact that in 1845 population here was able to feed itself and in order able to expand export food as well. And we no longer do that. We no longer feed ourselves in this country. So that's something that probably under this neo-colonial system we will never look at, but it's something we are going to have to look at. And it is a fundamental question of sovereignty, that you can feed yourself and you can feed your people. I'd like to ask you about two practical questions. One, Connolly, as I recall anyway, it's a long time since I read it, but when talking about the Young Irelanders, he castigated them for not inspiring and leading the people to storm the food, the granaries and the food storages and to actually feed the people. And I don't think he wasted any time thinking about whether they should be imbued with sovereign thoughts or anything else. He just thought they should be stopped from starving. And we can then speculate on what might have grown from that. But I'd like to take your view on that. And also, when we talk about opposing NATO, is this a question that we just say we oppose NATO? Or do we do something to oppose NATO? And if we do something to oppose NATO and people get arrested for it, as happened recently when 8 people were pepper sprayed in the eyes and one of them had his foot broken. Are we going to support those people, whether we agree with them politically about everything else that they do or not? Because if we don't, then what does this anti-NATO actually mean?
Thanks for both of those questions. When I decided to use Lawler as and the context of the 47 and 48 in this conversation as a vehicle, I wasn't thinking about the 47 and the 48. I was thinking more about our present moment. In that regard, that's when I think about Mitchell or Lawler in 47 and the urgency of making sure that people live, I compare that to I kind of drive it to the somewhat lower level of urgency right now. So pretty much my choice to hedge with the issues of sovereignty there is one of pragmatism for today's moment, rather than casting judgments on the young Irelanders of the time. So in that regard, I am being somewhat one-sided there in choosing what to present today as a rallying call, maybe more than full historical analysis. On the second question, I feel speak a lot, and fundamentally we are not supposed to be protesting NATO. In my very personal capacity, here's the controversial opinion: we are not supposed to protest NATO. We're supposed to resist NATO. It's not about saying, oh yeah, we dislike the concept of NATO, but we are to be clear that it's not dislike. It is the resistance to the concept, to the concept of Ireland in NATO, to NATO itself, and to recognize it every day that NATO is not somewhere out there, that NATO is an hour and a half drive from here, and that we are not operating within some ideal or idealist state. And from the perspective of supporting people who have taken action, I absolutely believe that support has to be put there.
I know you're getting a lot of questions, so you can give just a quick answer. You just mentioned something, was it capital, transcending capital?
Yes.
Like, if you could just make maybe one or two little quick points on that, appreciate it.
I am unsure if I could give it justice. Again, that is a very Xi Jinping position.
Okay.
Yeah, there's definitely a reference I can pull out for you later. But yeah, that was the quote from this month's monthly review. So there's a lovely article about that.
So there'll be a lot of maybe Chinese sources on that.
Yeah, and some of them definitely in English, especially the author that I quoted there.
So just to say very quickly on supporting anti-war activists, there was a very big, very great gig in Council on Thursday, raising funds for the 8 people who were arrested. Very powerful testimonies of everybody who had his and I think Monday at 10 o'clock I don't know if it's somebody anti-NATO way, but there are some people who were arrested and charged at the Votes Against Genocide protest who are having their hearing Monday, 12th of May at 10 o'clock, and have put out a call for support to show our solidarity there. And to talk as well, I agree with Munamonga. I think you make very clear that within the Marxist tradition there's always been some environmental component to it, even going back to the phrase like peace, land, bread would have always incorporated those ideals. So I I would say that given that with in the last few decades or so now, this kind of growing emphasis on environmentalism and so-called like green agendas or whatever, and that within that movement, some of the more, I suppose, class conscious people of it have come to the conclusion that really to overcome the environmental crisis or the climate change is about overcoming like the profit motive or the contradictions between labour and capital. But when they go onto these terms, I struggle to see what exactly they are actually adding to how we are supposed to be fighting against crisis, because ultimately they are coming to the same conclusions that people hundreds of years ago came to, and we have those theories and those tools to be overcoming that. So I suppose I'd just like to know about what your thoughts are on this notion of eco-socialism, which I never understood, frankly, no matter how many times that I tried to tackle it. So he said, like, you know, no green without the red, but fundamentally I'm asking, what even is like the green in the first place if it's just, like, is it not redundant to say, essentially, to say things like eco-socialism or like green with the red?
So that is that again goes right in the middle of the debates. Actually, no, it doesn't, because the debates in the eco-Marxist, eco-socialist circles are somewhat less fundamental than that. But it's an important question, nevertheless, and I would like to make the points here to give a shout out to Paddy Bresnahan and Naomi Milner's book, We Only Want the Earth, published last year or the year before, which speaks of the conditionally called third world environmentalism and push back against the first world liberal perceptions and capitalist capture of environmentalism. And from that perspective, when you read about the environmentalism of someone like Amilcar Cabral, you get to see the green as the green of environmentalism as the fundamental green of sovereignty. So that the national liberation, and again in that regard, Malm's two blog posts that ended up being that book, Question of Palestine is the destruction of Palestine is the destruction of the earth, published by Verso early this year, has the same line, that fundamentally these two greens are not separate, and it's just that environmentalism can be a way to recognize, can be a way to get into the question of liberation, into the question of ending the exploitation, and to recognize the mechanism of extraction, both from the population and from the environment. So in that regard, I would absolutely agree that it's a very short road from there to the tenets of Marxist thought that would have been predecessor to it, and that wouldn't be necessarily explicit. But I do recognize one perspective from Bellamy Foster there that does tie things in, and that the metabolic perspective in Marx is there and is very much one of environmental concern. Again, it's not, I don't really think that Saito's way of going in detail and discussing whether Marx knew everything or not is the way to go, and as we have much more pressing things to do out there. Eugene?
I think this, back to some of the points you made, I think the problem with not just with in the Irish left, but the left in Europe in particular, I think it's rudderless, directionless, doesn't really know what it's doing. where it wants to go to. I think it's absorbed so much of liberalism as a substitute for class that it's failed to actually understand what our society is about. And I find that generally capitalism understands the left better than the left understands capitalism. And I think that's fundamentally the problem. The left does not understand capitalism, what it is, how it functions, how it operates, how it shapes and develops and colonizes everything and settles everywhere, colonizes everything in his own interest. So it goes down to the land, they'll impose conditions on farmers, small farmers and everything else, but they'll not impose conditions on the data centers. You have to ask the question, why? Why? So other people's livelihoods, environments are being sacrificed for the interest of big monopoly capital. Big monopoly capital. So unless we try to understand those terms, then we don't find any answers. We don't find any answers. We don't find any strategy. Because basically, we are just basically reacting to what they do. We're just reacting to what they do. So you'll find most of the left would think that, oh, the European Union is a good thing. But who says it's a good thing? If you look at it, the processes, it is about European monopoly capital coming together to defend its market space. So why would anybody on the left of the labour movement support the consolidation of your exploiter? Why would you do that? The objective of the left has always been was to unite your friends and divide your enemies. Why should we go around saying, we should all come together? I mean, it's nonsense because it doesn't move anything. It doesn't get us any further along the road whatsoever. It doesn't challenge capitalism. All you're doing is basically reinforcing the structures of control, the methods of the methodology of control. So I think the question goes back to the environment. The European Union is imposing things because, other than that, they won't impose any conditions upon monopoly capital. And I think we've reached the end of COP20, whatever the hell is the COP out of 26. Because basically it was never going to go anywhere in the first place. Because what fundamentally would require would be fundamental controls on capital, on how capital is going to be used, and for what it's going to be used for. And that was never going to happen because the state, as I said, the state is something created by capitalism to protect its own and advance its own interests. So I think if the left want to change things, they need to find, like Laura did and Connolly did, they need to find anchors to anchor themselves in real struggles that matter. And that's where we challenge the right. And there was a demonstration of Cork there, and they banned the Irish tricolour from it. It was against the right. So they banned the Irish tricolour because it was a flag of nationalism. That's an appalling, absolutely appalling understanding of Irish history and what the tricolour means. Absolutely appalling to think people don't even understand the historical struggle of the Irish people. And once you do that, once you abandon that struggle, that ground, it's natural feeding ground for the right. A natural feeding ground. So you just basically walk about, oh, I'm not going to touch that nasty stuff. It shows how the barrenness of the left, completely barren of ideas. And so if they need to find anchors.
There are
anchors
other things from the States,
yeah.
you know.
Yeah, but say we need to anchor it in it, and that the anchors of what both Connolly and Fintan Law and the other revolutions of the Fenians was about the sovereignty. It was about sovereignty. The Irish people have control over their destiny, free from all outside external controls and fetters. That brings you the question: what controlling fetters are placed upon our people? That's your starting point. The question that political independence derives from sovereignty, economic and political sovereignty. So independence is important because how can you have a vote for a government that's decisions are overruled by somebody else? That's not independence. It's not independence. So the left wants to grow and challenge the right and challenge the state. It is about sovereignty. It is about independence. It is about democracy. And within that all that contained capitalism to a degree extracted the peasants from the land. It broke off that connection between the land people and the land itself and made them basically totally in order to depend upon their survival was to sell their labour power. They have no other means to exist other than sell their labour power to the capitalist class. So therefore, capitalism extracted the population from the land and made them actually subservient to the needs of capital. Because if they had land, then they actually might be able to feed themselves. Therefore, they would less the mechanism of control were weaker. So I think we have to get back onto this idea of sovereignty, independence, democracy, are the anchors in which the left can fight. Not some abstract nonsense of internationalism or shared sovereignty or all these other things that they can't be democratic, can't be independent in this world. They're all the ideas of the ruling class. Now to reinforce our own policies.
I was worried that we didn't have a respondent for this talk, but you can step down. Much appreciated. No, much appreciated. Yeah, that was
Well said.
Yes.
I'll just be quick. I came over late, so I was at the event over in Progression. But I'm part actually, I've just recently joined a collective called Via Campestina. I don't know if people in the room have heard of it before. So that is a collective of agrarian workers from across the world, so it is very international. And it's one of the things I've been finding when I'm very new to the group is that the struggles across the world are shared. And there's an awful lot of common ground of what we're experiencing, and it's also to look at the power of the agri-machinery and how interwoven big ag, you know, we kind of think as far, I don't know, maybe not, I shouldn't say this with everyone in the room, but I think there's a sense that farming is kind of diminished to the land and kind of simple ways of living, but the reality is the big ag corporations like Monsanto, Bayer, which is now part of Monsanto, there's a huge web of the pharmaceutical industry and the agri-industrial industry are all basically the same thing, they're all completely interwoven and owned by the same people. And we have a situation now with billions of tons of chemicals that are mined from the environment, like phosphorus mined out of the environment, nitrogen uses insane amounts of energy to manufacture. Those things can become weapons of war in one day and they can become fertilizers the next day. As we've seen with white phosphorus, we've seen with the explosion in Lebanon of stores of what could be an agricultural chemical or it could be a weapon of war. So the scale of the machinery of, you know, it's not, people have lost their labour, but they've also lost their complete sovereignty. They've been tied into a system where the farming system is completely locked into these agri corporations. That fertilisers, the natural, I'm studying soil science, the natural ability for the soil and plants, and that relationship between the soil and plants is destroyed by these chemicals to the point that then you have to continuously use those chemicals. And it takes 3 to 5 to 7 years to repair the soil, and a lot of knowledge and a lot of support to have your soil actually be able to grow crops to feed anybody without these chemicals. This is the insanity of what we're up against. You've pesticide industries, you've got Britain trying to roll back on bans against neonicotinoid pesticides. I didn't really appreciate how huge the scale of, and in Europe we make these chemicals, that we ban them in Europe, but then Bayer exports them all over the planet. Even though they're banned for use within Europe, and it's insane. You look at countries like India, I've been on Zooms with people from India, from lots of parts of the global south, where they're using all these chemicals still that have been banned for decades in Europe, and then you have huge companies, Chiquita, we can come up with loads of examples that will literally stop, will continue to use these chemicals, and no matter what countries try to do, these corporations are far too powerful. So I feel that it's important that we look at what's happening in Ireland, but also that we see the common ground across the world, and you have organisations like Via Campestina, and I'm sure people in the room know lots more, that this is something that we can be united by, because these corporations don't know borders, they operate with impunity across the globe. So that's personally how I feel about it. Anyway, there's a great conference on every January, it's called the Oxford Real Farming Conference. It's a social justice farming conference. It's easy to dismiss it, otherwise listen to a farming conference, but it's literally about social justice. They bring people from Australia to Latin America to India to Europe, all together over 2 or 3 days. There's thousands of people participating in it. It's phenomenal, and there's an awful lot to learn from those movements. The environmental movement was very radical, even in Ireland in the past. We had Tara, we had Shell to Sea, we had campaigns to shut down fossil fuel power plants, where the links between environmentalism, exploitation, and our dependency on these big corporations were very visceral and held. I think it's tragic that Ireland has lost its way in this regard. I'm lucky enough, I grew up in the time where I remember I was just about old enough to go to some of these protests, and I grew up kind of in that time. So I'm fortunate enough to have had that experience, and then things really went horribly wrong then after that. So not to lose the sight of that. And environmental protesting was, and in other parts of the world, I lived in Australia for years, it was the most radical protesting I've encountered. The forestry protests, the mining protests, they were led by environmentalists, but they could see the connections between all these issues. We really feel it's important not to lose sight of that. By the neoliberalism, which has come in relatively much more recently, like I was blown away with what they're doing in Australia. Like the Glen of the Downs is what they do every day of the week. Do you know what I mean? That's literally, I think people think the Glen of the Downs is their reality every day of the week. And that's in a place like that in Australia, which is telling you know how bad Australia is here in the room. So let's not lose sight of these things.
Thanks, Claire. I'll just respond very quickly to the first point there, the one on the corporate nature of things. Back in the day when GMO was first introduced, Richard Lewontin, he's an evolutionary biologist who wrote a great book with Levins called The Dialectical Biologist, pretty much building on Engels's Dialectics of Nature. And he also started the Science for the People, which was a very important movement during the war in Vietnam and afterwards. So Lewontin was kind of sort of ostracized for his position against GMO, because he was lumped together with everyone who would be opposing GMO on, say, quote-unquote, unscientific grounds, and questioning whether, are you against people having food? So the Lewontin's position there was pretty much that GMO is the platonic ideal of a capitalist good, because it has a kill switch. You can just stop selling it to someone and starve them out in a matter of a year. They need to buy seeds from you all the time, and you are able to introduce a monopoly to control a large system, and it's so fundamental. It's right on the base of the hierarchy of needs. So the capture of capital in that regard is both so massive, but also very much naturalized. It's very much taken to be the way things are done. Yes, Paul.
And I don't want to be disrespectful to the idiot who spoke about environmentalism, but isn't the problem, she mentioned some organisation at Capstina globally, no more than the problem we had with Sinn Féin that started out as a very good Republican activist movement with very hardcore members who worked solidly night, noon and day 20 years ago, 40 years ago. And what happened to all environmentalism, in my opinion, they all become part of the establishment and doesn't deal with the fundamental question, which is the mode and mean of production and the overall of capitalism. That's where everything lies. Everything we do is about how capitalism controls everything that we are about. The alienation of every human being is the result of capitalism. And what you have all over the world is all of these wonderful groups, but a lot of them just don't seem to be understand the whole role of capitalism. That's all that is.
Cheers, Paul.
Just to watch that, there's like it's such a broad movement, and like you said, quite new that represents people all across the world. I have seen examples in India where Bangladesh, where women who are in big Capstina set up their own banking systems and set up their own systems of education, their own training systems. So they're really, Dana Shiva is very incredibly outspoken about capitalism. That's just one example, and obviously, a very broad movement like that. It wouldn't be fair to say sweepingly make a statement about it. There might be parts of it, certain examples of it was not the case, but the idea of the movement is it's very broad and it's trying to bring together as many people across the planet as possible into a shared movement. So obviously there's going to be differences, but something like Ivana Shiva is one example of somebody who's extremely outspoken against capitalism, and they're definitely, I wish I knew more examples, but the farmers that I possessed, female farmers, were an amazing example of.
Sorry.
Anyway, thank you too.
No, I think that example of Claire, it's very good, and it shows as well how we in the left are not able to deeply understand what's the connection with land and alternative ways of organizing the production to move forward and be able to transit from a different mode of production. And exactly what Claire is saying, that was questioned, if you think in the reality in Brazil with the landless movement, the MST, they have cooperatives, they're not just, so it's not just a land movement, so there is as well this naturalist way of seeing land movements as something from the past, some third world thing. So I think we also neglect to develop these struggles and a strong connection to ideas of revolution and a proper organizing, because if you go to MST, they have they have cooperatives, they have university there to teach organizers from all around Latin America and even other countries from the global south that goes there to study. And what we study is Marxism, what we study is Lenin, what we study is what people in Europe study, but we also have Latin America theory very strong on the communist side, the socialist side. So I think we can't lose this perspective, because it's also a way of, this is also kind of show how we, in our analysis of red, green, we are actually epistemologically separately. Then we're not seeing the connection on the ground. So if you don't see the connection on the ground, your theory serves nothing, you know.
Yes.
If I might have a second bite of the cherry.